Thank you all so much for joining us to celebrate the mark of slavery, disability, race, and gender in antebellum America, and between fitness and death, disability and slavery in the Caribbean, two groundbreaking books in our Disability Histories series edited by Kim Nielsen and Michael Rembis. My name is Heather, and I'm the publicity manager at the University of Illinois Press, and I'm just going to go over some brief logistical information and introduce our moderator before we get started. First of all, thank you so much to Dr. Barclay, Dr. Hunt Kennedy, and Dr. Berry for being here today. They're going to talk for about 40 minutes, and then we will have time for a 20-minute Q&A at the end. You can enter questions throughout the event by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can use promo code OAH21 to get a 50% discount on the books on the University of Illinois Press website. The promo code and a link to the books can be found in the chat box. We will also be recording the event and posting it on our YouTube channel afterwards. You'll receive an email from Zoom after the event that will have both the discount code and a link to our YouTube channel as well. And now I will just briefly introduce our moderator. Dr. Berry is the Oliver H. Radke Regents Professor of History at the University of Texas at Austin and the chair of the History Department, the first person of color to take this role. Dr. Berry is a scholar of the enslaved and a specialist on gender and slavery, as well as Black women's history in the United States. She is the award-winning author and editor of 6 books. Her most recent publication, A Black Women's History of the United States, co-authored with Callie Nicole Gross, is an empowering testament of Black women's ability to build communities in the face of oppression and their continued resistance to systemic racism and sexism. Professor Berry completed her BA, MA, and PhD in African American Studies and U.S. History at the University of California, Los Angeles. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Berry. Thanks again to everyone for being here today.
Thank you so much, Heather, for the introduction, and welcome to this wonderful book launch of 2 phenomenal books on disability and slavery. I'm going to introduce the speakers and ask a few questions, and I'm anxious to see the audience interact with these wonderful studies. So our first speaker is Jenifer Barclay. She's an assistant professor in the Department of History at the University of Buffalo. She received her PhD at Michigan State University, and her work has been supported by a predoctoral fellowship at the University of Virginia's Carter G. Woodson Institute for African American and African Studies, and a postdoctoral fellowship in African American Studies at Case Western Reserve University. Barclay is the author of The Mark of Slavery, Disability, Race, and Gender in Antebellum America, published by the University of Illinois Press in the Disability History series. And she is also the associate editor editor for the Review of Disability Studies, an international journal. She is currently working on an edited collection, Cripping the Archive, Disability, Power, and History, with Dr. Stefanie Hunt Kennedy, our other guest, and has published her work in Slavery and Abolition, Women and Gender and Families of Color, and the Oxford Handbook for Disability History. Our second speaker today is Stefanie Hunt Kennedy, who is an associate professor of Caribbean, Atlantic World, and Disability History at the University of New Brunswick. She finished her PhD at the University of Toronto, where her dissertation won the Michael Finlayson Award for the Most Outstanding Dissertation. Hunt Kennedy recently published her first book, which we'll be talking about, Between Fitness and Death, Disability and Slavery in the Caribbean, at the University of Illinois Press in the same series, the Disability History series. She has authored several articles and book chapters that appear in journals such as Slavery and Abolition, and Social Identities. Professor Hunt Kennedy is currently collaborating with Dr. Jenifer Barclay on an edited collection called Cripping the Archive, Disability, Power, and History. In addition to this, she is the primary investigator of the Anglo-Atlantic Slave Law Project, a website that will provide worldwide access to British Atlantic slave laws from the earliest comprehensive codes of the 17th century to the laws that govern emancipation in the 19th century. This project is supported by the Social Science and Humanities Research Council and has an anticipated launch of the fall, September 2022. Oh, next fall. So I want to say thank you to both of you for writing these wonderful books. And just full disclosure, I have to say that Jenifer is one of my former students, just in case people were wondering. And I have a question that I wanted to start off with, to ask if you could each just tell the audience a little bit about your books, about the archives and the sources that you used, some of the challenges that you faced in doing this work on enslaved people with disabilities.
Sure, I'll go ahead and start, Dinah. Thanks so much for that really kind introduction and for being here. I'm so happy that you're sort of able to be here with us and to kind of celebrate, the release of the book. So I'm so happy that you're here. But to say just a little bit about my book. So in thinking about this book, when I first sort of came to the project, I was very interested in kind of thinking about the experiences of enslaved people with disabilities and thinking about the ways in which slavery as an institution was itself very disabling, whether in terms of the kinds of labor that enslaved people were forced to undertake, the kinds of punishments that were meted out to them, but then also just sort of the material conditions of slavery, the impacts that that had, for instance, on enslaved women during pregnancies and how that sometimes led to the birth of children with congenital disabilities, or even the kind of psychological and emotional impacts of slavery and the sort of toll that that had on enslaved people. And once I started to engage the historical record and looking at sources and thinking about the institution from this perspective, for me, it opened up like a whole new window into enslaved people's everyday lives, because then I started to sort of think about the social kind of relations of disability and how that impacted people's relationships with one another. That just sort of came through over and over and over in a lot of, say, ex-slave interviews and fugitive slave narratives. These kinds of traditional sources that I think historians of slavery have always used, but maybe just didn't read them from, the perspective of kind of thinking about disability. I know when I was doing my work, sometimes folks said, well, what sources are you using? And I would say, oh, I'm looking at Frederick Douglass and, like really, really common, well-known sources. And folks would go, oh, and then I would start to talk about, different examples and different stories. And then it was just like the light bulb goes off, like, oh yeah, like every other page, there's something, right? Like there's always sort of some discussion about disability. So that was one sort of big interest for me, was just thinking about people's daily lives. And then on the other hand, I was also interested in thinking about disability even more broadly as a category of analysis and thinking about how that intersected with representations of enslaved people with disabilities and the ways in which Blackness itself was sort of coded with the language of disability as a way to kind of disparage Blackness and to justify racial slavery. So then I just looked at a whole slew of other sources, medical journals and laws, the laws of slavery. I looked at political rhetoric from both abolitionists and pro-slavery advocates. And then I also looked at pop culture. So I even looked at blackface, minstrel shows, and freak shows. So there was just a whole array of sources that I looked at to kind of open up that part of the narrative.
Thank you so much. Professor Hunt Kennedy, I know your work it's sort of like the precursor to Dr. Barclay's work, and it's also the Atlantic World. So would you like to start a little bit about your sources, and can you tell us about the archives and about how you came to this project?
Yeah, totally. So, I mean, a lot of overlaps with Jen. So Between Fitness and Death explores the historical relationship between disability, anti-Black racism, and slavery, but in the sugar-producing colonies of the British Caribbean. And I look at this in an earlier period than Jen, from the 16th century to the early 19th century with the abolition of the slave trade. And the book also explores both the lived experience of disabled bondspeople, but also, British representations of Africans and their descendants as, kind of supposedly deformed or monstrous people. And also, like Jen, the sources that I use are really familiar to scholars of Caribbean slavery. So I look at European travel logs, slave law, runaway advertisements, plantation records, pro and anti-slavery rhetoric, but do so in the through the lens of disability. So, I show that the historical intersections between racism and ableism, I show these kind of intersections by tracing the development of a kind of English anti-Black racism. And particularly ways in which the English used disability or notions of disability, so like deformity and monstrosity, to argue that Africans were somehow unfit for anything other than the most brutal forms of labor. So the English notion that, Africans were a monstrous race, while it wasn't used to wholly justify slavery, it was certainly used to kind of mute opposition to African enslavement in the Atlantic world. And, I was really interested in how the discursive and the material go hand in hand when it comes to disability. So, the experiences of the enslaved depended both on how their bodies responded to the material conditions of slavery and the ideas enslavers imposed on their bodies. So from here, I moved from the kind of realm of representation to reality to look at the lives of enslaved Africans and the way in which they kind of revalued disability on the plantation. And, I think a big part of my book is to show, as Jen said, that so much of disability in slavery was actually produced by the violence of slavery. So the institution of Caribbean slavery was kind of designed to keep enslaved people in that liminal space between fitness and death, which is, of course, where the book gets its title. So disability was, I was interested in disability as a factor that kind of shaped the lives of enslaved, as well as the meanings of enslavement, and kind of disability as this kind of defining feature of slavery's violence.
Well, thank you so much for both of those opening comments about how you came to your project and the types of sources you used. It reminded me, and I think I've said this recently, that I wonder what you all think about the historiographical shift that both of your publications bring to scholars that are interested in the history of slavery worldwide. What do you think that using a disability lens, how will that reshape, this larger narrative of historical work that we have on slavery? And so you kind of both touched on a little bit, but I'd love for you to talk a little bit more. And I love that you both are using sources that scholars of slavery use all the time. And also you mentioned the familiar sources, and that when you think about who's in these sources and you're looking for this history, you're looking for evidence that it's actually right up under our eyes. So I'd love for you to talk both briefly about the historiography and what you think this shape is doing, and how you can build on these historiographies.
Sure. Do you want me to take this, Jen? And then I'll pass it on to you. So yeah, I think this is one of the most exciting things about disability history. It's by no means an emerging field anymore, but it's still not, well trodden. There's still a lot of areas that could be looked at anew through the lens of disability. And, as Jen and I both just mentioned, like the sources that are familiar to us, they just haven't necessarily been read through a disability lens. I found when I started doing this research that scholars of Caribbean slavery had in some ways been talking about disability all along, but it had kind of been on the edges of their work. They had been writing about the material conditions of slavery and the violence of slavery, and the kinds of like physical and emotional and psychological traumas that enslaved people experienced. But they didn't center disability as a subject in its own right, nor did they necessarily see disability as a way to kind of think about broader questions of power in the Atlantic world. And so, I was really inspired by, scholars who have kind of recently explicitly looked at the violence of slavery, like Vincent Brown and Sasha Turner and Shawande Mustaqim, and disability scholar Nirmala Aravelis, who all kind of look at all look at the violence of slavery. But I think when we see that through the lens of disability, we really see that the violent production of disability is kind of at the heart of histories of Blackness in the Atlantic world. So there's a lot of like really exciting things to do. And Jen, I'll let you speak to that as well.
Yeah, sure. I feel like there are so many different ways that we could probably talk about this, but when I think about just sort of the historiography of slavery, at least in the context of the United States, for me, like as I started when we first began the conversation, I mentioned just the sort of social relations of disability within enslaved families and communities, and I think for me, like I was able to kind of build on a lot of really classic, slavery studies scholarship, reaching back even to some of the classics like Bassingame and other folks who, were very interested in thinking about you know, the formation of slave communities. And, you know, I mean, even, you know, classic work like Deborah Gray White, she looks at, you know, the ways in which gender impacted community formation amongst enslaved women. And for me, it kind of opened up the space to think, well, how does disability fit into this? Like, how did that create spaces for enslaved people with disabilities, because they were so devalued by stakeholders? You know, they were sort of kind of fallen off the radar because they were perceived of as, you know, quote unquote, useless or worthless as laborers. So, you know, in the context of American slavery, they just sort of fell off the radar. They were under the radar. But what that meant is it opened up a space for them within the communities that they belonged in, and their families, where they could do so many different kinds of community-centered labor and work. Like, you know, I found example after example of, you know, enslaved people with disabilities who cared for children while their mothers were working out in the fields, or that were taking kids back and forth to the fields so that their mothers could nurse them and care for them. And that, to me, like, that is, you know, in the context of slavery, that's a major contribution that, you know, these folks were able to do precisely because they were disabled and devalued. I know in your work, Daina, you talk about, you know, enslaved people's prices and the values, different values, and the ways in which enslaved people were valued. And, you know, this notion that, you know, from the outside, slaveholders were, you know, had their own sort of monetary value and worth that they were placing on enslaved people, but from within their own communities, within themselves, right, that they had their own sense of their own value and how they fit. And that was, you know, those kinds of ideas were very inspiring for me to think about that. But I think disability studies and disability history also opens up a much bigger window into sort of thinking about the intellectual history of race and how, you know, disparaging ideas about disability intersect with Blackness. And that, you know, also kind of, you know, opened up a much larger conversation again about issues of power, sort of thinking about the creation and maintenance of racial hierarchies, and the role that disability played in that, because it was, you know, really quite significant, but one that doesn't necessarily come through in a lot of histories that deal with the intellectual history of race.
That's really good. So I have another question. Both of your books demonstrate that the historical relationship between disability, that there is a historical relationship between disability and violence. Can you describe what it looked like in the antebellum South for Jen, and then in the Caribbean for you, Stefanie?
I'll let you take that stuff.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so I guess I'll start by saying that, you know, when I started doing research on this topic, I found it kind of difficult to map some of the social theories that had become really central to disability studies onto the Caribbean, particularly because it was a colonial space and because disability was so violently produced. So for instance, it's been really important to contemporary disability rights to think of disability through the social model of disability, and that disability is not a tragedy. But when we place that in the context of the colonial Caribbean, it doesn't really map neatly onto that kind of historical context, because of course, disability was produced by the violence of slavery. And so in that sense, you know, it was quite tragic. So thinking about, you know, tragedy as also as kind of historically produced and needing to be understood in historical contexts. But, you know, for the Caribbean, you know, bondspeople were subject to legally sanctioned punishments that could temporarily or permanently disable. But slaveholders, I think the most important thing about slave law in this regard is that slaveholders had almost sovereign power to punish enslaved people however they saw fit, and privately on plantation grounds with impunity. So this led to a host of disabling punishments meted out onto enslaved people's bodies, as well as their psychologies. So Caribbean people were also subject to, you know, incredibly hostile kind of material worlds, disease, malnutrition, as well as the chance violence of slave owners and managers. And also, you know, because I think, so for instance, like in the Caribbean, the slave population did not reproduce itself naturally. And this was in part because of that kind of material depraved world. And also because Caribbean slave owners calculated that it was more efficient to treat enslaved people, or to work enslaved people to death and replace them with new laborers than to treat them better so that they might survive. And then, of course, I think the other forms of violence that we need to consider are the ones that were not physical, that we can't necessarily see easily in the archive, but the traumas of forced migration, of natal alienation, of the separation of families, and really of the loss that is at the heart of colonialism. We can see glimpses of this, for instance, in runaway advertisements that describe wounds of attempted suicide on enslaved people's bodies. And I'll just quickly add that I think the other element to this is that disabled bondspeople were subject to particular kinds of violence because they couldn't keep up with the demands of sugar production. So Mary Prince's narrative shows this really well. She describes many instances in which herself and others were beaten and tortured and killed because their bodies could not keep up with the demands. And so I think there's a lot to be said about the kind of violence that often accompanies disability, and that historically speaking, particular kinds of violence have been meted out against certain kinds of people, certain groups of people.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. And I'm thinking that Jen will have similar, for those that just have joined us, we're talking about the intersection between disability and violence in enslaved communities. And Jen, can you say something about the Antebellum America?
Yeah, sure. In many ways too, the law kind of came to the forefront, of my study in that sense too. I mean, in addition, again, to the kinds of just, labor and, the material conditions of slavery that were very violent, that produced disability. Slave laws, all the way reaching back to colonial North America. I mean, disability was sort of all through those, whether these were manumission laws and sort of fears of, trying to curtail who was manumitted, and to ensure that they were able-bodied and perceived of as, people who were not likely to kind of become a charge, right? A public charge or an expense for the community, but then also, punishments for various kinds of crimes were incredibly disabling. I know it was almost sort of shocking to me when I was doing this research, and I was looking through a lot of these different kinds of laws. In some cases, runaways, for instance, there was this whole sort of progression of punishments that runaways would have to experience in different states that might start with branding or something like that to mark them as a runaway. But if they continued to flee bondage, at some point, one of the punishments was to cut their Achilles tendon in their leg to actually physically disable them so that they couldn't run. And one thing that I found was that over time, at least, sort of by the antebellum years, once the importation of enslaved people from West Africa was kind of cut off after 1808, after, the Second Great Awakening and just sort of different kind of shifting ideas within society, some of those practices faded away. And then things like whipping just sort of came to stand in for all of these, previously very disabling kinds of punishments that enslaved people experience. So, there were those really overt examples of violence that disabled enslaved people that were sanctioned by the state, that were institutionalized in laws. But there were also, as Stefanie mentioned, other kinds of violence that I think was every bit as just as horrific and lasting, but maybe in a way that happened sort of more metaphorically. Like even the work that I did on blackface minstrelsy and freak shows, those representations were so ableist and so racist, and had such a long-lasting impact in American society in terms of the ways that people thought about race and thought about Black folks. I mean, like, these are some of the most enduring images, I think, from American pop culture, and disability was sort of infused all through that. And that's a different kind of violence. That's a kind of violence that lingers in a different way, I think, in a society. So that was probably one of the most challenging chapters for me to write in the book, because some of those depictions and representations and performances were just really over the top.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I have about two more questions, and then we have some questions from the audience. The first one is, how do we reinterpret disability or representations of disability in relation to power? So we've talked about disability and violence, but now let's add power to the mix and see where we go. So what do you all think about that, and how have you encountered that in your work?
Yeah, I mean, if I could just sort of jump back in here, because it really sort of dovetails with what I just mentioned about, some of these representations, that unfolded in all these different registers of American society in the antebellum years, again, law and medicine, but also, pro-slavery rhetoric and anti-slavery rhetoric. I mean, the ways that disability was used in all these different spaces to kind of metaphorically link disability and Blackness together as a way to justify slavery, it really sort of entrenched and maintained and produced these racial hierarchies, and disability was an essential part of that. Part of I think it's an implicit sort of argument of my book is that, the relationship between whiteness and notions of ability and, sound-minded, like being sound-minded and able-bodied and all of these, sort of aspects of the body that are privileged become linked with whiteness. In the sort of imaginary, right, in the sort of social understandings of whiteness, in juxtaposition to Blackness, which was linked, metaphorically again with these ideas about disability. Those are, really deep structures in society again that, continue to carry on, like these links continued long after slavery ended. That's something that I sort of touch on towards the end of the book in particular. Even when I think about scholarship, from the late 19th and early 20th century, folks like Darrell Michael Scott and others who talk about damage imagery and so there's this continued link, this continued pathologization, I think, of Blackness but we don't think about the relationship that it had with disability and how central that was throughout the antebellum years.
Stefanie, what about the Caribbean? Do you want to share?
Yeah, so I think, I have, I guess, two examples, but very different. So on the one hand, I think enslaved people reinterpreted disability as it relates to power, in the sense that they revalue disability at times to negotiate the terms of their bondage. So they would, as well as to evade capture if they had fled the plantation. So for instance, like enslaved people might feign a disability or might exaggerate an impairment so that they could move from field labor to less physically taxing labor positions. Another example is how enslaved people kind of masqueraded disabilities or tried to pass as able-bodied to evade identification. So in runaway advertisements, sometimes subscribers, slave owners would say something like, has the marks of the chiggers, but covers it with a handkerchief, right? So it tells us a lot about enslaved people's awareness of their bodies and the knowledge that plantation authorities had. And then we also know that disability was revalued as a spiritual gift among Obia practitioners, as well as voodoo priests and priestesses. But like Jen, I think this question could also look at the way in which representations of disability were taken up to kind of maintain racial hierarchies. And so in the Caribbean, in my book, what this looks like is the way in which abolitionists portrayed enslaved people as kind of broken, supplicant bondspeople, kind of in need of whites to save them from slavery. And of course, this is kind of exemplified in the famous Wedgwood seal, am I not a man or a brother? And in this way, they kind of use disability to appeal to British sympathies and a kind of growing charitable culture toward the disabled in the metropole. But what's interesting, I think, about this is that the figure of the disabled bondsperson in abolitionist rhetoric was particularly powerful in the wake of the Haitian Revolution, which had created among whites throughout the Atlantic world this kind of fear of revolutionary insurgency and emancipation. And so abolitionists' representations of the disabled bondsperson kind of contrasted with another competing figure that circulated in this era, which was that of the able-bodied, armed, Black, male revolutionary and anti-slavery rebel, exemplified by Toussaint Louverture and the Haitian Revolution. So these two images kind of embodied two different paths to freedom, right? The choice between revolutionary emancipation on the one hand and emancipation as a process of legislated and imperial reform. So I think it's interesting to think about the ways in which disability was used as this kind of powerful image, this powerful rhetoric, to envision a Black subject who in her or his freedom was not a physical threat to the British Empire, right? So disability representations allowed for a kind of possibility of incorporation while blunting its radical potential.
Wow. Very powerful. Okay, we only have a few more minutes for our portion. I wanted to see if you all wanted to ask one another a question. I have another question we can ask, but I'd love for you all to ask each other a question. And we have some really great questions in the Q&A. So,
yeah, I have a question for you, Jen.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it's such a delight to be here with Jen. You know, we often speak of our friendship as just this really great academic friendship because we've just celebrated one another's work from the very beginning. And in many ways, we could have been pegged as competitors, but instead we've just really supported one another. So it's just such a treat to be here with you today, Jen, and celebrate the launch of your book. So one of the wonderful things that I think really comes out in your book is the importance of disability in shaping community among the enslaved. And I was wondering if you could just expand on that, what this looked like and what this means for thinking broadly about the fields of disability history and history of slavery.
Wow, that's a really great question. And, you know, like you said too, Steph, I'm really glad that you're here. And we have had this like amazing sort of journey and this really great friendship that has just sort of developed around us kind of working on similar projects. And, you know, sometimes we have these amazing conversations about our work and similarities, but also the differences and, you know, all those little nuances that nerdy historians, I guess, would know about our own work, you know. But that is a great question. And I appreciate that because I think for me, that's one of the most important parts of my work is that sort of work that I've been able to do on, you know, how disability sort of informed and shaped enslaved people's communities. And when I was listening to you talk about power, it reminded me of something that, you know, it's sort of part of the story, and it's the ways in which some enslaved people with disabilities were perceived within their own communities. And I'm immediately reminded of conjurers, right? Like who were sort of healers within enslaved communities. And many conjurers, right, were actually enslaved people with disabilities. Sometimes they were elderly folks or older folks who had disabilities. Sometimes they were younger folks with disabilities, but somehow their disabilities often sort of evoked this idea of power, like this sort of spiritual power that was sort of, that they embodied. And there's one of my favorite examples that I think kind of speaks to you know, the confluence of these issues of disability and community and power is this guy Dinky. He was a conjurer on a plantation outside of St. Louis. And, you know, people really were sort of, they were kind of afraid of him. They kind of gave him a wide berth because they were concerned, right? Like he had all this perceived power. And he, you know, folks saw him as someone, they described him as very African. And he was also someone who had lost an eye. So he only had one eye. And this all sort of fed into this mystique around this man and this notion that he, you know, was spiritually powerful, that he could kind of see beyond, right? Like the here and now. And one enslaved person even said of him, he said, you know, Dinky is, and this was a quote, his own master. Like he was able to do whatever he wanted to do. He could travel where he wanted, he could eat when he wanted, he could sleep when he wanted, he could work when he wanted. And this was, you know, like within like slave communities, he was perceived a certain way, but even, you know, like white folks in the area, like they were also equally afraid of him, which I thought was just fascinating. And, you know, like it's very telling in terms of the ways that disability can sort of shape perceptions, in this case, within and outside of communities in really significant ways. So I think for me, the use of a disability lens to think about the history of slavery was just really illuminated so many different dimensions of things. And, you know, there's so much great scholarship on, you know, slave health and medicine. And, you know, like, and I really like truly value and admire that scholarship, but it also, you know, like disability kind of comes up in it often, but folks aren't actually actually thinking about those dynamics of disability. They're sort of more looking at the disability as a reflection of an illness or a condition, or, you know, like as a way to sort of diagnose and treat things, like looking at it through this more clinical, objective lens, right, of medicine, as opposed to kind of thinking about those broader sort of social dimensions that I think a disability lens kind of opens up on that part of this history. So yeah, and I think, you know, for me, if I could ask you a question, when I think about your work, I think what is so significant about it, and I love that you look at, you know, an earlier time period, you're looking at a different region than me, and I want to sort of give you the opportunity to talk about what I think is probably one of the most significant and important aspects of your work, and it's just sort of focus on the Caribbean, and in terms of thinking about how your focus on the Caribbean, again, sort of impacts like histories of slavery and histories of disability in really different ways. So I would love if you could speak about that, because I think that's such an important part of your work.
Thanks, Jen. Yeah, totally. I mean, as I mentioned before, I think when we think about disability and slavery and colonialism, you know, it really kind of challenges certain aspects of traditional disability scholarship. I think when we look specifically at the Caribbean and the sugar producing colonies of the British Caribbean, it kind of challenges the implicitly kind of Eurocentric geography and kind of timelines of traditional disability scholarship. So for instance, you know, those of you who are familiar with disability history will know that there's kind of been this argument, this kind of timeline of disability history that's been kind of taken up by many disability scholars. And, you know, it posits that the disability as we know it today did not exist in the pre-modern era. Rather, the kind of predominantly agrarian nature of pre-industrial economy allowed for disabled, impaired people to kind of participate in daily life and take up productive and kind of socially valued roles. But with the onset of industrialization in the 19th century, impairment was kind of the understanding of impairment was changed with industrialization, and the kind of intensification of economic logic and industrial capitalism meant that people with disabilities were no longer valued as part of this productive economy, and they became outcasts, et cetera, et cetera. But when we look at the Caribbean, you know, it really makes us rethink this timeline, because and really our ideas of modern ideas of kind of labor and working bodies and impairment. So drawing on the works of you know, classic canonical Caribbean scholars like C.L.R. James and Eric Williams and Sidney Mintz, you know, I show that Caribbean sugar production really began in the 17th century as an industrial enterprise. And the enslaved body was defined by its relationship to an economy driven by production. And, you know, sugar production was dependent on not only field workers, but also, you know, the technical mastery and skilled artisanal knowledge of sugar boilers and other workers. So it was kind of precociously industrial and modern. And, you know, so, and yet despite this, the Caribbean has been kind of forgotten in the kind of Western timeline of modernity. So I think when we place disability at the center of our analysis of Atlantic slavery, we really have to rethink these timelines and kind of the conceptual borders between metropole and colony, as well as the borders between, you know, free wage earning laborers and unfree non-wage earning laborers. So I think a part of my work that, you know, that a big part of my argument is that plantation slavery was really a necessary precondition for both industrialization and modern concepts of and displays of disability. And so, you know, Between Fitness and Death illustrates the integral role of enslaved laborers in the Caribbean to our understandings of labor and disability and modernity, and that plantation slavery in the Caribbean should be considered among one of history's most disabling systems of exploitation.
Thank you. So I want to go ahead and I really appreciate the comments, but I want to go ahead and open up to questions, because you have lots of wonderful, very detailed questions from our audience members. And you can both jump in on whenever you'd like, but the first question is really about congenital disabilities. And what does it mean when you find enslaved people that were born with a disability that wasn't necessarily violently produced? So how do you grapple with that, or do you grapple with that in your work? And then the second part of this question is also about whether or not you found details about disabled slaves who escaped or who were manumitted. And I know I've seen them in runaway ads. I know both of you use runaway ads. So congenital enslaved people.
Sure, I can sort of start with that, because this was something that I was very interested in, you know, as I sort of thought through, you know, the lives and experiences of people with disabilities under slavery. And you know, it did sort of pose its own interesting questions, I think, because in part, I connected this oftentimes, again, to the material conditions of slavery and their sort of impacts on pregnant women, right? Because, you know, sometimes that could lead to the birth of children with congenital disabilities, but obviously that wasn't always the case. But there were, you know, sort of many examples. And what I saw was, you know, sometimes sort of examples of, you know, the death of children with congenital disabilities, who, you know, were then, you know, just sort of taken up as almost as medical specimens, right, by the medical community. So there are examples, you know, of conjoined twins being, you know, kind of pickled in a jar of brandy and put on a shelf in a doctor's office, in a physician's office, or being passed around, again, as a medical specimen for other physicians to look at, you know. But then, you know, there are other examples. I'm thinking immediately of Millie and Christine McCoy, who were conjoined twins born in North Carolina, who, you know, they were the youngest of, you know, their mother had several children, so they had several siblings. And I think, you know, my understanding is that from the perspective of the slaveholder, it was kind of like an annoyance, because folks were coming from all over to kind of see these kids who they thought were so extraordinary. And what ultimately happened with them was that, you know, their owner sold them so that they could be, you know, basically displayed on the freak show circuit. And, you know, at one point, several points, they were kidnapped, they were taken to England, and, you know, their mother, which it was a really fascinating story for me, because, you know, their mother, Mona Mia, she went with a white man to England to reclaim her daughters. And there was this, you know, she was pregnant when she left, and her child was born in England. So theoretically, like, she gave birth to a child that was free. She was free because by that point, you know, abolition had happened. And, you know, she could have chosen to stay, right? But the rest of her children and her husband were in North Carolina. So she came back. And the status of her son, who was born there, was really ambiguous. But, you know, slavery ended, you know, a few short years after that. So that sort of his status was resolved by that. But I mean, there are so many examples of that, those kinds of instances in the record. And another tension that I saw was, you know, for slaveholders, the extent to which they wanted to try to, you know, kind of use emerging forms of medicine to quote unquote correct or fix congenital disabilities, so that they could then, you know, hopefully kind of reclaim their property and reclaim, you know, access to an able-bodied enslaved person whenever they grew old enough to labor. So there were examples of slaveholders sort of investing in, you know, different kinds of medical strategies to try to, you know, quote unquote, fix congenital conditions. But then other times, when slaveholders were very standoffish about it and didn't really seem to care very much, they didn't want to invest much money in these children who they saw, again, as sort of worthless and useless.
Stefanie, did you want to add anything to that, or to address the runaway?
Yeah. Thanks for that, Jen. And maybe I'll try to answer the second half of the question. So in Jamaica, it had become so common for enslaved people to manumit elderly or disabled slaves because they were not seen as like productive laborers anymore, that a law had come out to say that the owner and not the state had the responsibility to care for these people. So, you know, it tells us a lot about kind of like a kind of Atlantic world, a wider Atlantic world kind of unease with the display of disabled people, because once manumitted, you know, they became, this is the complaint of the assembly, that they wandered the island and became kind of beggars in the city centers, right? And so the assembly comes out and says, you know, plantation owners have to deal with this. It's not our responsibility anymore. And so, we know that that had become custom. The other far more violent way in which planters dealt with this was to charge disabled or elderly slaves with crimes that they were innocent of and have them executed for the sake of insurance, of the insurance return. And that had also become quite, a custom in British Caribbean slave societies. And then we also do know that enslaved people left the plantation and sometimes didn't have much resistance from plantation owners, again, because they saw these laborers as kind of burdens to the estate. Yeah.
Thank you.
And to maybe say a little bit more about that, because I missed like a great opportunity to sort of talk about runaways, because, again, one of the sort of classic stories, at least from the antebellum era, were the fugitive slaves, William and Ellen Craft. And the disability scholar Ellen Samuels does an amazing job sort of talking about the ways that disability was such a central part of the ruse that this couple used to escape slavery, because Ellen passed as a white man, an elite white man who was a slaveholder, and she passed as a person with disabilities as a way to kind of take her husband, who she reframed as her slave, and they said that she was going to the north for medical treatment, and she and her husband were able to actually board trains and leave the South and escape slavery, because she was passing as white, she was passing as male, but she was also passing as disabled. So, disability came in and out of that ruse as needed for her and her husband to be able to flee slavery in Georgia and to escape to freedom in the North.
Thank you. So we have 10 questions and 10 minutes left. So we're going to do a lightning rod. We're going to try to do a lightning rod to get through. There's some really great questions here. So the next one is, I'm really interested in Stefanie's point about complicating the social model by writing tragedy back into disability history. How might this expand the way we write about disability in other eras or situations? And the second part of the question is, are there other places where you think we need to bring the contextual tragedy back into our interpretation? And I'm not sure if people want their names named, but that was from Sarah Hadley Cousins. And the first question was from Jasper Connor.
Yeah, I can speak briefly to this. I do think that, as I said earlier, that, when we look at colonialism and in particular, like, forms of violence that produce disability, the social model just doesn't really fit. And so I think I understand its importance to contemporary issues, but I think colonialism really challenges. I think it takes a different set of methodologies than those formulated in the Northern Metropole to understand the Global South and to understand disability and colonialism. We need to be thinking about different methodologies. We can't just take what's created in the Global North, in the Global Metropole, and apply it to the colonies. It doesn't fit.
Thank you. This is another question from Miles Wilkerson. How do you recommend historians of disability and chattel slavery address the silences? So this is, earlier there was a question saying that about how do you deal with the silences? Stories of disabled enslaved people are particularly rife with and difficult to answer these questions, and they're silent in the archives. I'm sure I butchered her question here, but.
Yeah. That's a really important question, because I think that is something I had to be very attuned to in my work. And I know Stefanie and I have talked about this as well, because there's so many different factors that can lead to those silences. Like I did not come across many cases, like sometimes students or folks will ask me if I came across cases of maybe disabled enslaved children, who were killed by slaveholders who just didn't want to be. And I have not come across any sort of documentation of that, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen. Mm-hmm. That could just be one of those silences in the record because people are very aware of how, of not wanting to document that. So there are many different ways that I think those silences like that, we have to think about what they mean and how to sort of interpret them whenever we think about our sources. And, even like when I look at, say, medical journals and, articles that were written by physicians and, the enslaved people with disabilities, their voices aren't present in those things, but we can still glean a lot of information about them and their lives and sometimes even their feelings by reading those sources closely and thinking about them from the perspective of enslaved people with disabilities, as opposed to the physician who was kind of writing them.
Okay, another question for both of you all. Can either of you talk about, maybe Stefanie, you can start this one. This is from Ava Perkis. Can either of you talk about more about the writing or research techniques that you all use to thread the needle of examining slavery as a disabling institution, explaining the effects of that institution on the bodies of the enslaved people, but avoiding describing the enslaved as a disabled race? And I know both of your books absolutely touch upon this. So Stefanie, do you want to start that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think, both Jen and I, what we really see is the way in which ableism and racism work together, and how they're, at least in my period, they're kind of mutually constitutive, right? A kind of anti-Black racism and an ableism. So it's like looking at representations of disability and the way in which disability is often used in the pejorative, right? It's often used as a kind of trope to, criticize women, to criticize people of color, et cetera. So, and I think, so that's kind of, I think, the second half of your question. In terms of like research and writing techniques, and looking at slavery as a disabling institution, I mean, when I think about, as most of us do, like the question I had at the very beginning of the research project, compared to what actually was produced, it expanded so much, because what I found was that slavery as a disabling institution is not just that it disabled enslaved people's bodies, but that the institution itself was disabling. It limited people's mobility. It limited their freedom of movement. It was on all levels, at every stage of enslavement. Disabled or enslaved people were kind of threatened by this kind of disabling violence at multiple levels: physical, emotional, psychological.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah.
Real quick, there's a source here in the Q&A that I tried to cut and paste and put in the chat for everyone, but it wouldn't let me, from Bob Whitney, about a post-emancipation period from the United Fruit Medical Reports. Anyone interested in the Circum-Caribbean, from 1911 to 1931, there was a medical department, and they have lots of information there for those that are interested in disability studies, particularly the Caribbean. So I just wanted to share that briefly. We have another question from Ashley Tisdale. And the question is, how might assumptions of disability and hyperability have contributed to the justification of enslavement? Excellent question.
Yeah, that's a great question. And that was something that, I certainly thought of in many different ways. But, I think especially for me, I tended to think about the kind of inherent contradictions of like kind of racial ideology and how it was being framed through disability, and in some cases like hyperability, because like part of what intrigued me whenever I started this project was these sort of notions that enslaved people were somehow perfectly suited for this kind of labor. But then at the same time, there were all of these different examples that I was seeing, this rhetoric of disability that was being woven into justifications of slavery. And, even like the one that always sort of stands out to me are pro-slavery folks who said that, freedom would lead to insanity. Even in some cases, they argued like physical degeneration. So like slavery, they argued, was the best place for Black folks to be. They linked all of that together. So I was definitely very, very sort of interested in trying to pull those things apart in the work.
If I could just add on to that, because I think, Jen, what you've just said about pro-slavery rhetoric is similar to the Caribbean. But also, if you look at like slave traders' descriptions of certain parts of sub-Saharan Africa, there's like a kind of, it's like a geography of like ability to be an enslaved person. So, people from, the Congo are this, and Igbo people are that. And you see traders and planters speak of Africans from certain parts of, sub-Saharan Africa as particularly suited to enslavement. And also using the kind of rhetoric of intellectual deficiency. to justify their physical hyper ability to slavery, right? But also, I would say part of what made someone quote unquote fit for slavery, according to these people, was their kind of acquiescence. So they're kind of, you know, that they would be kind of subdued. So there's a lot of ways in which ability is defined in this period, particularly as it pertains to enslaved Africans and their descendants.
Thank you. So we have 3 minutes left, but I want to read, there's about 4 or 5 really, really good questions here. I can read them just briefly. I'm going to try to truncate them so that you all can pick and choose which ones you want to answer. We have one that's about women, and were women considered disabled and were they punished because of menstruation? That's one question. Another question is about the intersection between disability studies and the history of medicine, which we kind of touched on a little bit, but in particular, they want to know, Yan Lee wants to know what kind of knowledge and practice of healing shared among the enslaved people that helped alleviate their pains and facilitated the formation of their own identity. That's another question. 2 others, one from Albert Stabler says, is there any way to compare or connect the biopolitics of maintaining enslaved people's health for labor and reproduction with the necropolitics of disseminating enslaved people's, free people's capacity during and after slavery? Final question from Signe for me is, there's a 2-part question. One, your work, do you consider mental illness or impairment as a disability? It's a question. And have you come across instances when those with mental impairments were prosecuted for criminal conduct? And could you talk about how and whether that was a factor in the legal outcome? Whew, got the questions out.
Yeah. There's so many great questions.
But I wanted you to hear them, and I wanted the audience to hear them as well. So pick and choose whatever ones you want to go with.
I mean, I can speak to the last question about mental illness. I mean, I did consider mental illness to be a psychological disability. And again, like, you know, we're taking very modern terms, so it looks different in the early modern period. Sometimes it just says like that they're mad or that they have fits, which could be epilepsy. You know, it also could be what people perceived as, you know, madness. I didn't look at criminal conduct, so I can't speak to that, but certainly that plantation records do sometimes indicate, you know, or give kind of reference to someone's mental state. And I also think that, you know, it's a much broader topic of the psychological traumas of slavery that I think is gaining more traction among slavery scholars. So that's a really exciting, again, potential for disability and slavery to come together. Great. Jen, do you have a chance to answer one of those questions?
Yeah, I'll just say a few words about the question about menstruation and thinking about gender and disability. You know, I think with menstruation, that may be a whole other conversation, but for me, it immediately triggers sort of thinking about the ways that slaveholders kind of pathologized childlessness among enslaved women, because they were very concerned, at least in the American context, about women's reproductive labor. So for enslaved women who are perceived of as, you know, not being able to have children, you know, they were sometimes punished for that, sold away. Like there were a lot of sort of social implications that kind of raised in their lives. So certainly childlessness was seen. And I was also intrigued by the way that childlessness is sometimes framed as an act of resistance, as opposed to maybe sort of thinking about it as an actual condition that, you know, enslaved, like, so what's the difference between sort of thinking about it as an act of resistance versus of, you know, as a disability?
Well, I want to thank both of you. We are out of time, but as you can see from the rich questions in the Q&A, there's a lot of interest in both your books. I think they are both groundbreaking. I think they'll open up the doors for many new scholarship in multiple areas, not just slavery, but also many fields. We're crossing many fields here. And I just want to encourage everyone, as a former Illinois author, to go out and purchase these books and use them. I'm sure that they'll be the subject of many graduate courses coming up in the next year or two, but these are also very accessible books that you can use for undergraduate courses as well. So thank you both, Dr. Hunt Kennedy and Dr. Barclay, for your work, for your scholarship, and for your time today. And thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you, everyone, so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Daina.
Sure.
Thanks, Daina.